One way of thinking about what Bitcoin is, and indeed what money is in general, comes from an island in the Pacific Ocean called Yap, where at Yap they don't have metal. There's no metal at all on Yap. So to create money, what they do is they sail and open boats 250 miles across the Pacific to a neighbouring island called Pulau, where they have a particular kind of limestone that they don't have on Yap. And they quarry the limestone and shape it into these distinctive circular shapes with a hole in the middle, some of them at the British Museum if you want to see them. And some of them are massive, they go up to like 12 feet across. And then they sail these stones, they're called Fei, F-E-I, back to Yap, and where they're used as currency. And the thing about them is they're impossible to steal because they're very, very big, but by the same token, and you can't fake them because there's none of that limestone on Yap. And they're kind of a record of the labour that went into the making them, because again, there's no shortcut. You can't kind of half-bakedly pretend to quarry it and shape it. You've either quarried it or you haven't. But they're impossible to move because they're so big. And so what happens with some of the Fei is that they rest outside someone's house, and if someone wants to buy something with it to spend the money, what they do is that they agree that the ownership of the stone is transferred, even though the stone itself is in one location. So if I'm, buying your house, I can use my Fei to buy it, and so now that Fei belongs to you, even though actually it hasn't moved. On the way back from Pulau, the 250 miles to Yap, they've been caught by a storm, the people who've quarried the Fei stones, and have had to choose between the stone or their own lives, so they've chucked it overboard. But then when they get back to Yap, they've said, look, we quarried this 12-foot Fei stone with a hole in the middle, but we had to chuck it overboard. And it's generally accepted, oh yeah, okay, fine, that's still your Fei stone. And they've been able to spend the money embodied in that stone, even though the actual stone is 5 miles down at the bottom of the Pacific, but still everyone who agrees who owns it. And that actually is what modern money is. It's a register of who owns things. That's the crucial thing about the nature of money. And that's why Bitcoin is so adaptable to the modern world of money, because Bitcoin is that register. It's a contemporary, it's a 21st century universal version of that Fei stone sitting outside someone's house, where all you need to know about it is who owns it, and that ownership can be indefinitely transferred. So the way Bitcoin works is based on cryptography, on codes. So the first stage is the public key, private key thing of Bitcoin is sent to an address, which is just a string of letters and numbers. And then that transaction is sent to the Bitcoin network, which has a series of what's called nodes on it. These are computers all linked up that effectively make Bitcoin run. And what they do is they take a chunk of these transactions, they do it 10 minutes at a time, and they run them through a thing called a hash. Now, a hash function is a very standard cryptographical technique. You can look them up on the internet. There are loads of them. There are different ones that give different answers. And that takes a string of text of any length. You can do it with anything from the sky is blue to the entire text of the Bible. And you run it through a hash function and you come out with the same length, irrespective of the length or complexity of the text, a string of letters and numbers that are completely sensitive to the initial input. So if you change a comma, you'll get a totally different reply. Every letter and number different. So the computers on the network, they're known as miners, which I think is actually, it's a bad metaphor really, because it's more like a kind of process of clerking or account verification or something. But anyway, what the miners on the network do is they take this 10-minute block of transactions and they run it through a hash function until a specific hash called SHA-256. And they run it through SHA-256 until they get an answer that has a string of zeros at the beginning, has a specific number of zeros at the start. And those zeros are there just basically to make it difficult to get the answer right, so that every computer in the world can't immediately, bang, jump to the answer. So that they have to go through this process of work. And the computers, there's no shortcut. It's just trial. And as we speak, there are trillions of mathematical operations taking place every second, attempting to solve Bitcoin hashes right now. That's going on right now, all around the world, with Bitcoin miners doing it. And then the first one to get the correct string of zeros and then an answer broadcasts it to the network. And the network in effect votes on it. It runs it through the protocol that on all the computers running Bitcoin. And if enough of them think the transaction is valid, they certify it as valid, they give it a timestamp, and then it's added to this chain of every transaction that has ever happened in Bitcoin. That's one of the hardest things to get your head around, but this process has within its history, that hash function encodes the whole history of all spending in Bitcoin. So it's a really, and it's one of those things where when you explain it to people, they normally say, no, I don't understand, because it sounds as if what you're saying is the whole history of Bitcoin is present in every transaction. And that's exactly right. That is what's happening. The whole history of Bitcoin is present in each 10-minute block that's then sealed off and stamped. And the idea about that is that it makes it impossible to fake. You can't then cheat or diddle or find a way around the fact that every computer on the network has a copy of this register. So you can't sort of add money to your own bank balance, because every computer on the network has a copy of it. You can't do what's called double spend, you spend money in two places at the same time, because every computer on the network has a copy of the same register. And that's the decentralized nature of Bitcoin. The register is everywhere, and that's its prime security feature. And then what happens is that the computer that got the answer first, broadcast it and got it validated, this is a really clever thing, that computer is paid in Bitcoin for having done the work, because that answers the question of, well, where's the incentive? Why would you do that? Why would you use tons of computer power and all the energy involved to solve some arbitrary mathematical puzzle? And the answer is because you're paid in Bitcoin and the Bitcoin have value. So that's where I suppose the mining metaphor really comes from, that you're paid for doing the work, keeping the whole enterprise going. And there's a big argument in the Bitcoin community at the moment about whether Bitcoin has failed. One of the lead developers on it, an Englishman called Mike Hearn, has argued that the experiment can be declared over now. And it's because of an apparently esoteric fight over something called the block size, which is to do with those 10-minute chunks of data and of transactions have a limited size in kilobytes, in how much data they can use. And to grow, to become more widely adopted, to become especially more widely adopted as a way of doing just buying and selling things, really that block size has to be bigger, because it's just not quick enough, because transactions are slowing down just because there's not enough data to process them. And the analogy with the big credit card companies is interesting, because they transact thousands of things every second, a company like Visa, whereas Bitcoin, these 10-minute chunks, there's just an obvious built-in roadblock. So one section of the community wants to bring in something called Bitcoin XT, which has a bigger block of data, just so everything can go quicker and it can be more widely adopted. Where there are other voices who currently control Bitcoin who prefer a route of sticking to the original block size, even if that means it doesn't get as widely adopted. And in fact, perhaps it's better that it doesn't get more widely adopted and become, in effect, contaminated by commercial use, but retains this kind of clarity of intent as a sort of mathematical tool, and not become, as it were, the new form of credit card. There's a philosophical crisis really with Bitcoin, because the initial paper published by this anonymous person or persons calling him, her, it or themselves Satoshi Nakamoto on 31st October 2008, not long after Lehman's had collapsed and the whole global financial system was on the edge of crisis, which is probably no coincidence. And the original paper talked about a decentralized form of cash, a kind of frictionless form of cash moving directly from one person to another, completely separate from the existing systems of banking and finance. And one of the real challenges to Bitcoin's future is the fact that those forces of banking and finance have actually got really, really interested in Bitcoin, especially in the blockchain, in this thing of a ledger held in multiple places at the same time that holds a record of all the transactions that have happened. Because the thing about those ledgers is that they can do things incredibly effectively, more or less for free, apart from the computing costs. Legal contracts go through automatically. You can make payments automatically. You can take an enormous amount of work and costs out of the existing system. That puts banks in a difficult position, because actually those costs at the moment, broadly speaking, are their profits. $1.7 trillion of value disappears every year in payments. That's the amount extracted by financial institutions. If the blockchain is a way of doing that for free, that's a really significant threat, a real game changer to the existing businesses in finance. So they want a piece of it. So actually, one of the ironies is that the biggest threat to Bitcoin is that it works to such an extent that the existing players in banking and finance effectively take it over.